Thank you. Is this on? My voice is, it's on. My voice is really loud anyway, so it comes in handy when you're an educator to have a big voice. So, welcome to Indianapolis Classical Schools. Specifically, welcome to Heron High School. We are hosting the second event in this partnership between Indianapolis Classical Schools, Edge Mentoring, and the Trinity Forum in the newly designated You know, I've probably done that maybe twice in my life. I'm sorry. Newly designated Joanna Beatty Taft Gallery. So, as you know, Joanna is our founder, and we welcome her, and her husband will be here in a minute, and thank you for coming and being involved in this. I'd like to also welcome some other Indianapolis Classical Schools board members. Mindy Cunningham is here, Keith Steiner and his wife Jane Ann, and John Watson. Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Doug Wilson and the Wilson Family Fund and Greg Enos and the Enos Family Fund for sponsoring tonight's event. We really appreciate it, and we are so thankful to have all of these people here tonight. I do have some breaking news this evening, and I think we even have some press here. Today, just today, actually a little bit after noon, the U.S. World and News Report issued the latest national high school rankings. Heron High School is in the top 1.3 percentile of all the public high schools in our country. For those of you who want to check my math, and that always makes me nervous, we were ranked 390th out of 28,000 public high schools. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Cherie Harder. I've been told that I cannot give you her full resume because she'll get embarrassed. But I feel like if you don't understand just what this woman has accomplished, you need to. And I'm just going to say one thing. She currently serves as president of the Trinity Forum. But prior to joining the Trinity Forum in 2008, Ms. Harder served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President and Director of Policy and Projects for the First Lady, Laura Bush. Please take a moment and Google her, and you will be as impressed as I am. Ms. Harder.
Well, thank you, Janet, for that very gracious introduction. And on behalf of all of us at the Trinity Forum, we are so delighted to be here and so delighted that you're here. If you had friends who wanted to be here and couldn't quite make it, we will be posting video from tonight's event. We'll be posting different things on Twitter. You can follow along, as well as on Facebook. So look it up, tag your friends, welcome other people to come next time. I should also add just how pleased we are to be working with our partners, with Heron High and Riverside High, as well as Edge Mentoring and Janet Neal and David Neff. And we're delighted this is going to be an ongoing series with special thanks to Doug Wilson and the Wilson Family Fund and to Greg Enos and the Enos Family Fund, whose generosity and support have made tonight possible. I also want to say just an extra word about Doug Wilson, who's really the catalyst and the generator for tonight's event and even this ongoing series. It's really been his vision, his enthusiasm, his amazing powers of connection, and his work as, shall we say, a venture catalyst that has made tonight's program possible. Many of you here are already familiar with the extraordinary work of both Heron High and Edge Mentoring, but Trinity Forum may be a little bit less familiar to you, so I'll say just a few words about who we are and what we do. Part of our mission at the Trinity Forum is to work to provide a space and resources for leaders to grapple with life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this not only by providing readings and curricula which draw upon classic works of literature and explore enduring questions that connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of today, as well as sponsoring programs like this one tonight that aim to connect thinking leaders with leading thinkers in engaging those big questions of life and ultimately coming to better know the author of the answers. And certainly we're at a time when such conversations are both more needed and more rare. Certainly civility in public life has never come easily. We have a long history of incivility. Colonists in the Revolutionary era saw fit to tar and feather disagreeable Tories. The Civil War era brought brawls within the Senate chamber, not to mention the Civil War itself. The Jim Crow era certainly saw some of the vilest displays of intolerance in recent history. Virtually every decade holds examples of citizens stigmatizing, marginalizing, or demeaning those of unlike mind. But the past few years seem to have brought dramatic increases in polarization and division among citizens, and with them, new lows in public behavior and discourse. Increasingly, televised conversations devolve into shouting matches. An air of menace hovers over many political gatherings. Twitter trolls have literally scared their targets into hiding. And the pluralism that has sustained so much of the American experiment is devalued or even disdained by those who are charged with being its defenders. Meanwhile, though even by some measures around 95% of citizens believe that incivility is a problem, we collectively continue to gravitate towards the extreme, the divisive, the nasty. Generating fear and loathing is often the quickest way to be heard, get likes and retweets, even raise funds. That which grabs attention is rarely that which warms hearts or bonds friends. So at a time when so many of our public conversations are marked by incoherence and invective, how do we talk to each other in a way that cultivates and fosters respect and collaboration? Can we find ways to cultivate community even in the midst of deep differences that divide us? These are difficult questions, and certainly there are not any easy answers. But our speakers tonight have wrestled with these questions on both a national and a local level, both theoretical and practical, and will offer thoughts on a new way forward to cultivating civility in the public square that enables and fosters community, friendship, and collaboration, even amidst difference. Michael Ware came to the DC as a 21-year-old campaign staffer to help lead the faith-based outreach efforts for newly elected President Barack Obama. You can do the math, he's still quite young. And became one of the youngest staffers in the White House in recent American history. He served as the deputy director of the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, where he led outreach efforts and helped manage the White House engagement on religious and values questions. And then since leaving the White House, he founded Public Square Strategies, a firm that helps religious, political, and business organizations navigate the changing American religious and political landscape. He writes widely, even amazingly prolifically, for The Atlantic, Christianity Today, USA Today, Relevant Magazine, and many other publications, and is the author of Reclaiming Hope, Lessons Learned in the Obama White House about the Future of Faith in America. Responding to Michael and offering a real-world practitioner's perspective on civility and the means of cultivating community, or where the rubber meets the road, shall we say, will be Allison Melangton. Allison is the Senior Vice President of Hulman Motorsports, and therefore an expert in the matter of rubber meeting roads. She previously served on the executive leadership team of Indiana Sports Corporation for 20 years, serving the last 2 as president, and served as the CEO and the president of the 2012 Indianapolis Super Bowl host committee, and has received 5 Emmy Awards for her previous work as an associate producer for NBC Sports during various Summer Olympic Games. She was awarded a Sagamore of the Wabash by Governor Mitch Daniels and named a living legend by the Indiana Historical Society, and serves on the board of directors of One America Financial Partners, Visit Indy, the Arts Council of Indianapolis, and the Indy Chamber of Commerce. After Michael gives opening remarks, Allison will provide a response and practitioner's perspective, and then Dave Neff from Edge will pose the first question to our speakers before opening it up to questions from the audience. Michael, welcome.
Really honored to be here. I would like to thank Cherie and Trinity Forum, Colleen and Alyssa for all of their help. Thank the incredible staff and board and leadership here at Heron High. I didn't need the U.S. News and World Report to tell me this was a phenomenal school. I was able to be here earlier this afternoon and get to meet with some of the students and steal some of the artwork off of the walls. So I need a jet out of here right after. Thanks. Really wonderful to have such a great conversation partner in Allison. And I'd like to welcome a few friends here. Andrew Falk, who's one of the great entrepreneurs here in Indianapolis. Erica Anderson, who is a soon-to-be published author and is a model for civility here in Indianapolis and nationally. And really, really humbled that they came to attend. Would like to thank Dave and Greg and Doug for their support as well. These are truly times of great division in this country. Allow me to catalog just some of the more outrageous events of this modern political era. We, of course, remember the claims during our most recent presidential campaign where Hillary Clinton supporters were called godless and characterized as, quote, those who walk in rags and sleep amid filth and vermin. Vicious personal epithets are even today leveled against President Trump, as one prominent New York lawyer called him a, quote, barbarian, a yahoo, and a gorilla. In one New York newspaper, a preacher of all people referred to Trump as a, quote, unshapely man. What does that have to do with the substance of our politics? It's not just words, of course. We know incivility reigns when just last year we saw 2 senators get into a knife fight on the Senate floor. And I know we were all shocked when Vice President Mike Pence, your governor, shot and killed former Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner in a duel. Okay, you caught me. I have not been entirely truthful. It was not supporters of Hillary Clinton who were said to walk in rags and sleep amid filth and vermin, but the supporters of George Washington. New York lawyers have called President Trump many things, but it was actually George Templeton Strong who called President Lincoln, not Trump, a barbarian and a yahoo. And Henry Ward Beecher called Lincoln unshapely. It wasn't a knife fight, but a caning that took place on the floor of the U.S. Senate when Representative Preston Brooks attacked Senator Charles Sumner in retaliation for Sumner's criticism of slaveholders, including a relative of Brooks. The official website of the U.S. Senate describes the caning on the Senate floor as, quote, symbolic of the breakdown of reasoned discourse. I'll say, yeah, that pretty much does it. And finally, it is common knowledge that it was not Mike Pence killing Tim Geithner in a duel, but Aaron Burr, who infamously shot Lin-Manuel Miranda. Here's the point. Incivility in politics is not new. American politics has always been intertwined with and informed by personal animosities and egos. Yet we can be careful not to romanticize the past while also not downplaying the danger in our present. Something has changed. Social science makes it clear, but even if it didn't, we feel it in our lives. Tonight, I want to offer some thoughts on the value of civility, the misuse of it, the character of our incivility and what so often justifies it, and how we might root a resurgence of civility today. Civility is what philosopher and former president of Fuller Seminary, Richard Mouw, called public politeness. It amounts to a set of norms that make up a code of public decency. In politics, civility shows itself in respect for disagreement and the right to express it. It shows itself when we acknowledge the best in our political opponent's line of thinking, the best in our political opponents themselves. It is mercy and forgiveness. I've come to think of civility most succinctly as public grace. Though I suppose one could apply civility to all kinds of relationships and circumstances, civility is most properly thought of in the context of interactions in public with individuals brought into contact in the context of community outside of personal and intimate relationship. There is a kind of decency and decorum that ought to be afforded to those we do not know that is unnecessary and superfluous to relationships with our family members or close friends. This is very difficult for us to understand today. It is a paradox of today's world that our capacity for interaction for some level of community has expanded while our understanding of commitment has grown more narrow, our conception of who deserves our respect and how they earn it circumscribed. Mao writes, "To be good citizens, we must learn to move beyond relationships that are based exclusively on familiarity and intimacy. We must learn how to behave among strangers, to treat people with courtesy, not because we know them, but simply because we see them as human beings like ourselves. When we learn the skills of citizenship," Aristotle taught, "we have begun to flourish in our humanness." Civility is the kind of thing we tend to discuss when it's violated, but I believe it's just as recognizable and felt when it is evident, when it's present. That is to say, civility is the kind of thing that we appreciate when it is present to a similar degree that we miss it when it is absent. This is because civility reflects a recognition of human dignity. Incivility is toxic because it always stems from a lapse in the recognition of human dignity, a recognition of the dignity of others, or a recognition of one's own dignity. When our political discourse lacks civility, it inflicts a distinct harm on citizens. In his essay, Membership, C.S. Lewis wrote, "Our society must think much about politics as a sick man must think much about his digestion. However, if either comes to regard it as the natural food of the mind, if either forgets that we think of such things only in order to think of something else, then what was undertaken for the sake of health has become itself a new and deadly disease." Our culture, and many people in it, are sick with that new and deadly disease. I've become convinced recently that politics is causing great spiritual harm in America. It used to be that we could look at D.C., look at our state capitals, and think that partisan and political animosities were contained there, that those places did not reflect real America. This is no longer possible. The American Psychological Association found that 52% of Americans felt additional stress due to the presidential election. They called it, quote, election stress disorder, and recommended steps people could take for relief. Teachers reported students were fearful about the election outcome, even to the extent that they were having nightmares about it. Political campaigns understand and feed into this emotional pull of politics. Increasingly, political messages are not about policies. Instead, the policies proposed on the campaign trail are about sending a message and propping up a desired narrative. Our politics is both driven by and guiding our emotions. It's really important. Our politics is both driven by and guiding our emotions. And the influence of political tactics is not confined to campaign dynamics. It affects how we are formed as people. Political polarization is at an all-time high. Instead of our values influencing our politics, our political circumstances are shaping our values. As partisans, we explain away the flaws of the candidate we support and buy nearly any outlandish theory about the candidate we oppose. We even change what we believe to fit the moment. This is not just about our views on politics coarsening. Politics has coarsened how we view our neighbors. Polarization is seeping into our very communities. There was a study in 2014 from Stanford, kind of the benchmark study that showed polarization is at an all-time high, and there was an interesting data point attached to that study. In the 1960s, when parents were asked, who would you not want your child to marry? They responded, I would not want my child to marry someone of a different race, and I would not want my child to marry someone of a different religion. In 2014, the same question was asked. If the parent was a Republican, I would not want my child to marry a Democrat. If the parent was a Democrat, I would not want my child to marry a Republican. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Now, I'm used to speaking in churches, so I'm very comfortable with affirmations. It's ridiculous. That's exactly right. Think about what that means. Obviously, the political consequences are clear. We see this playing out now. But think about what it means for how we live together, for our social relationships, if they are being driven by something as fleeting, as liquid as political party identification. Think about what it means for how we live together. Oh, wait, of course, we know from other studies that we no longer even live together. Studies have come out showing that we're segregated ideologically on geographic terms. We know that we only receive media from sources that affirm our dispositions. It's a significant problem. Incivility is driven by forces like partisan animosity. Incivility is promoted by a political discourse that is increasingly reliant on symbols and pop culture rather than the concrete and more limited, tailored terrain for which politics is meant. There has always been a role for entertainment in politics and political discourse, but never before has politics been able to saturate our culture and our lives as it can today. In this environment, civility seems impossible, fanciful even. But if it's clear what motivates incivility, what resources can we draw on to fuel civility? I want to cover 3 topics. The first perspective that we can bring to our political discourse is that we enter the public in order to help people. It is really striking to me how quickly, how easily, how subtly we can slip into treating that which concerns the public into that which only concerns us as individuals. This is where incivility gains leverage, because we forget that politics is a shared project and instead treat politics as a personal enterprise, disagreement as a personal affront. My friend John Tyson, who serves as a pastor in New York, recently observed the use of violent language when describing personal successes. This violent language is pervasive in our politics as well. She smashed his argument. He killed in that debate. Democrats were crushed in the last election. I've been hearing that one a lot lately. How have we lost sight of the people in our politics? When our politics is unmoored from its impact on people, then it becomes merely a competition, a forum for self-aggrandizement and the expression of partisan animosities. Citizenship calls us to engage differently. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. When the Apostle Paul was writing to the Galatians, he was addressing a community that was in deep disunity. Paul had helped form the Galatians through his teachings, but they were straying from their foundational commitments. Sin, false teachers, parochial motives, and interests were creating, polarization. Paul's letter to the Galatians then represents an attempt to speak clarity into the conflict and help the community reform around its foundations. And it's into this polarized environment that Paul instructed them to do something radical, something completely contrary to everything polarization promotes. He wrote that they ought to, quote, carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the love of Christ. Paul's command shows no favoritism. His call is not to one group only, to those with power or without it, or even solely to the strong or the weak. Everyone together is part of a community as children of the same God, and therefore they ought to carry one another's burdens. A nation is a different sort of community, but it is a community. And the call to carry another's burden is an extraordinary one, but these are extraordinary times. In our increasingly polarized nation, when many elected officials and their strategists believe they need to listen only to those who already agree with them, we must carry our neighbors' burdens into politics with our own. We must ensure those we disagree with are heard as well. Political engagement motivated by service is much more likely to support civility. When we enter into the public square, our goal is not to win, but to come alongside our fellow Americans, those in our community, in pursuit of the truth and in pursuit of a shared way forward. But even here, there are pitfalls, so that even as we enter the public square to serve, we must have our desire to serve tempered by a humility about our capacity to serve well, to know what is right, to know what is truly, what is actually helpful. A spirit of humility, then, allows us to act without the presumption that we have all the answers, as well as without the burden of needing all of the answers before we act. I like how John Anazu describes humility in his book, Confident Pluralism. For Anazu, humility does not reflect a lack of conviction, but, quote, the limits of translation and the difficulty of proving our deeply held values to one another. Humility, Anazu writes, recognizes that our human faculties are inherently limited. Our ability to think, reason, and reflect is less than perfect, a limitation that leaves open the possibility that we are wrong. Incivility often stems from a loss of patience with our neighbors, an indignation that they do not and may never see the world as we do. Yet patience is often in shorter supply for the zealous convert to a cause than the long-suffering laborer. I've noticed in my time in politics that contrary to what one might assume, what I had kind of assumed, it is not the person who is most vulnerable who is the most vitriolic, not the person who has come up against resistance and persevered for what they believe to be right who is most bitter, but the person for whom these issues is primarily emotional, the person who is trying to prove his commitment rather than just be committed. The person who has advocated for an issue for a long time is able to track the progress that has been made, is aware of the various points of disagreement, and understands the terrain. The recent convert is often battling self-hatred that it took him so long to see the light and can take it out on those who have yet to see it for themselves. I've arrived, when will you, they seem to say. Humility suggests to us that none of us have arrived, that even positions that have been well considered and hard-earned might be wrong, might have unintended consequences, might not achieve that which we desperately want to achieve, or we might come to learn that our aims were not set on the right target in the first place. Humility will give us the ability to separate a person's thinking from a person's dignity and help us to recognize and respect the latter even when we vehemently disagree with the former. So a spirit of service, a spirit of humility. Finally, I want to point to hope and a belief in something that is ultimate beyond ourselves. Hope has been derided as too esoteric, too ethereal for our very practical challenges, but this amounts to a fundamental misunderstanding of hope. I will not recount my case for hope that I make in my book, which I guess is appropriately titled Reclaiming Hope, but allow me to point to just one example of how hope is a resource for practical life, including civility. There's a document I found a few years back signed by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. It was prepared for those who would be participating in integration of buses in Montgomery. In anticipation of a Supreme Court mandate ordering the integration of buses, King, who was then president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, suggested this would, quote, referring to the integration of buses, this would, quote, place upon us all a tremendous responsibility of maintaining, in face of what could be some unpleasantness, understatement, a calm and loving dignity befitting good citizens. The document goes on as two sections. First, general recommendations like, quote, not all white people are opposed to integrated buses except goodwill on the part of many. Or another, quote, in all things observe ordinary rules of courtesy and good behavior. And then listen to this, quote, be quiet but friendly, proud but not arrogant, joyful but not boisterous. And then finally, be loving enough to absorb evil and understanding enough to turn an enemy into a friend. Be loving enough to absorb evil and understanding enough to turn an enemy into a friend. The document then continued to lay out specific suggestions, including, quote, if another person is being bothered, do not arise to go to his defense, but pray for the oppressor and use moral and spiritual forces to carry on the struggle for justice. Now, there's a lot there. And we could spend an entire lecture just talking about this incredible document and the sources that influenced it. But the main point I want to make is that this kind of approach, this civil approach, is impossible without a commitment to deeper things than self-interest and simply the besting of one's opponents. At the same time, civility is not passivity towards the concrete, toward directional outcomes. King's faith and confidence in Jesus first, and then in justice that was the will and providence of God second, allowed him to ground his activism, his political engagement, in certain moral commitments. The epigraph of my book is a King quote that strikes directly at this notion. In it, King said, "My friends, we have followed the so-called practical way for too long a time now, and it has led inexorably to deeper confusion and chaos. Time is cluttered with the wreckage of communities which surrendered to hatred and violence. For the salvation of our nation and the salvation of mankind, we must follow another way." In the face of great injustice, civility seems impractical, even offensive, and yet we should be careful before we discard it. We might find that what we could accomplish with incivility is much better accomplished with it, and that once civility is discarded, it is very difficult to reinstitute it. I think we're learning this now. I'll conclude with a caution and a story. Clearly, I believe civility is critical, and I'm deeply concerned about the coarsening of our public discourse. I imagine many of you share this concern. But I want to warn us, that talk of civility is often used as a misdirection. Incivility is not an excuse to deflect on issues of public import. And when civility is used as a way to silence ideological opponents, it does nothing but promote cynicism and ultimately undermine civility itself. We should reflect ourselves on whether we employ calls for civility in circumstances that might hinder our political ambitions, or whether we only call for civility from those with whom we disagree. In many ways, it reminds me of another topic I've been discussing a lot in my travels lately, and that is my conviction that Americans are increasingly going to politics in order to get their emotional needs met. I believe this is true, and I say it because I want to encourage people to think about whether this is true in their lives. But I do not recommend going up to an individual person and telling them, you know, I think you're using politics to fill an emotional void in your life. Not a great conversation starter. Similar to that situation, I think civility is the kind of thing that best operates at the cultural level, and then as a mode of self-critique, first of oneself and then of one's political allies. The last thing I want you leaving this talk with is the impression that what is needed is for the other side, whoever that is, to act more civilly. That's not a constructive way to go about this civility business. Civility requires courage, it requires humility, it requires a spirit of service, it requires hope and a bigger perspective. And I'll close with just one story that touches on, I think, all of these themes. One moment of the 2012 campaign remains a high point for me. And there weren't many. It was a pretty dreary campaign. But this one was a reminder that our politics can create good culture, not just division and insecurity. Jenna Lee Nardella is something of a wonderkind. At age 22, she co-founded and served as the executive director of Bloodwater Mission, a nonprofit that has raised more than $25 million. Bloodwater Mission has brought water to more than 1 million people in Africa, provided health care for more than 62,000 people in HIV-affected areas. And her influence and example have also had an outsized impact on the justice conversation in the American church. I was running faith outreach for President Obama's re-election campaign at the time, and the Democratic National Convention lasts 3 days. And so as faith outreach director, that meant I had 6 slots to fill for the invocation and benediction each night. And I asked Jenna Lee to serve in one of them. For an evangelical Christian, the decision to speak at an event like the Democratic Convention cannot be taken lightly. The last thing you want to do is get involved in a controversy that could harm your ministry, either from anti-religious inquiry or from a donor base upset that you would dare pray with Democrats. Which is why we haven't asked you to pray tonight. I don't know if your boards would. Jenna asked for a bit of time to consider the invitation, during which she prayed and consulted with her husband and the board of her organization, and they encouraged her to take the opportunity, and so Jenna accepted. I smiled when I received an email from a campaign staffer flagging something in Jenna's prepared benediction, as if a siren had went off. She had included a prayer for Mitt Romney, too. I assured the staffer that this would be okay and that, well, it was too late to make a change anyway, so we were just going to have to go for it. And so on the night of the convention, and of course political conventions are all about both sides, the whole thing is talking about how great you are and how awful the other party is, right? At the end of this convention, directly following First Lady Michelle Obama's keynote, Jenna walks out onto the stage, and with heads bowed and eyes closed, she led a stadium full of Democrats in praying for Barack Obama and Mitt Romney and for our nation. The prayer was a ray of light in a pretty depressing campaign season. Christians and others shared the video of Jenna's prayer online as an example of what can happen when we hold our faith and each other's dignity as more sacred than partisan politics. In an increasingly polarized politics and culture, this is the role we all can play. We can take risks in the political and public arena to affirm that some things are more foundational than partisan politics, and when we see others do so, we can support them as they face people who do not understand. What Jenna taught us that evening was that politics can be about more than winning. And this is the promise of civility as well. The presence of civility is a reminder to our fellow citizens that we are invested in this project of self-governance together, that their dignity warrants some basic level of decency as they enter into the public square, as we enter into the public square for their benefit, even if we disagree on what that entails. Civility does not answer all of our problems. It is no panacea. Civility will not erase injustice, but it helps provide a framework for political efforts to do so. It helps provide a vision for politics that is about more than the acquisition of power and the reckless use of that power. And I think we need more of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Your words tonight are a very important truth that need to be heard. If you have not read his book, you need to do that. It is exceptional. So make sure you either get that tonight or pick it up. Your comments regarding service as the motivation for our political and personal engagements were particularly inspiring to me. Our motivations for serving our communities in all the ways that we serve, and so many of you in this room serve this community in so many ways, and that inspires me because that's where we find common ground. It's our motivation on why we're doing these things and why we're doing them together is where we do find that common ground. I believe that God made human beings to want to be unified and not to be divisive. And I think incivility stems from typically flawed and self-focused motivation. So I'm a big fan of this topic, and Michael has done an incredible job framing that for us. So I want to provide a few remarks and comments that we can think about locally in some of the things that I've witnessed and been a part of in my last 30-something years here in this community. One of the things that Michael's remarks brought to light for me is, this is a simple statement, but it's absolutely true. You don't have to agree with one another to be kind to one another. And that is so simple, but it is so true. And we have to all take that and own that in this community. Civility toward each other is how we find a way forward together. And of course, we are all stronger together rather than being divided. On a local level, I have hope in this community. I've seen it over and over and over again that this community can pull together, and we do pull together. And certainly we've had our hiccups across the board in a variety of ways, in politics, in sports, in education, but we have proven over and over again, and a number of you in this room have been a part of that, where we can come together. We also benefit from the fact that this community is the right size to impact change. We have a community where your voice can be heard, and it has been heard for years and years. That's what has progressed this community, and that's what has changed it. In 2012, I had the honor of leading this community for the 2012 Super Bowl, along with a couple other people in here. Hi, Bill Taft. I saw you sneak in at the back. We have a rich history here of civic volunteerism, and the hearts for service in the 4 years leading to the Super Bowl were never more evident. And while a couple of the examples I'm giving you are sports-related, you can't do these major events, these major projects, the Indy 500 at the track where I am now, you can't do them without political conversations and without political leaders coming together. It's impossible. So while my career has been in sports rather than in politics, I do feel that I have been around politics a lot and had a seat at the table. For the 2012 Super Bowl, our political leaders, our legislators, our businesses, our organizations, our residents, and our public safety agencies came together to collaborate. And it was such a blessing for me to be in the middle of all of that because we did get everyone on the same page to come together for the collective good and not the individual good. That took hard work and it took discipline, but it worked. And so we know from this community we've done it before, and on varieties of topics we can do it again. We actually, this community won the National FBI Award for Community Leadership because we were able to, for the first time in a Super Bowl, get all of our law enforcement agencies on the same page. So we did get national recognition for that in Washington. The way our community and our residents and our businesses and our politicians approached the Super Bowl really had a distinct difference from other communities that had hosted the Super Bowl in the past. Many of those Super Bowls were full of divisiveness and fractured relationships, working in silos, and many of those things caused those communities not to prosper in the end. Politics can cause polarization, but so can hosting a Super Bowl if everyone looks through the lens of what's in it for me. We took a different approach here, and as I said, many of you were a part of that. Our approach, the leadership, not me alone, it was the leadership of the whole group, including Bill Taft back there. Now that I see you, I'm going to pick on you. Our approach was inclusion, collaboration, and civic unity through love and kindness. And again, you don't have to agree with everyone to be kind to them. The idea was preposterous to many people that we're going to love people and be kind to people as we're putting on one of the world's largest sporting events. It was like Michael's reference from the Apostle Paul to carry each other's burdens at a time that may have seemed like the last solution that was going to work and be successful. It seemed out of place. Love and kindness as a strategy can also seem out of place. We had one particular Super Bowl staffer who moved to Indiana to be closer to an aging parent who moved from Washington, D.C., actually, from the world of politics. And she had been on the job about 3 months, and we had about 3 years to go, and she came in my office one night, and she shut the door and said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "Of course, my door is always open." And she said, "We're never going to get there. We'll never be done in 3 years. This Super Bowl is never going to happen." And I said, "Why do you feel that way?" And she said, "Because you're too nice to everyone." It's never going to happen. We have to tell people what to do. We have to force people to do these things. We have to tell them how it's going to be. And I said, that's not how we're going to do it. And our leadership has decided that we will come together as a community. We will have these conversations. We will have the hard conversations, but we're going to do it through love and kindness. And that is how this community is going to separate itself from the other Super Bowls that we've had. And as leaders, we need to communicate that expectation and that behavioral standard to our teams and to our staff so that there is no confusion. After the Super Bowl was over, I got the nicest thank you note from her, and it said, "Thank you for softening me when I didn't even know I had to be softened. DC had turned me into someone else." I'm sorry, I'm not picking on your place. And I feel like I have returned to be the person that God intended me to be. So the erosion of our civility to one another starts many times, and we don't even know it, and we don't recognize it. And then it becomes a habit, and then the stalemate begins. Working with people in civility, kindness, and love does not mean that you're a big pushover. You can be a very firm negotiator, a strong leader, and still be very civil and kind. Opposing viewpoints do not give us permission to be hostile to each other, and in fact, they are certainly less productive in my experience. Throughout the Super Bowl planning, there were many days of tough negotiations, incredibly difficult people, problems, and challenges. But we still got things done. We grew stronger together as a community, and throughout that process, the results spoke for themselves. After the Super Bowl was over, I flew to New York for the wrap-up meeting with the NFL. It was about 2 months after the Super Bowl. And many of you here know Mark Miles, our board chairman, that was the board chair for the Super Bowl. And he was supposed to go to New York with me for the wrap-up meeting, which you hear legends and stories about the wrap-up meetings and the feedback you're going to receive about what you could have done better. And I got to the airport in the morning and he wasn't there. And he called me and he said, "Gosh, I can't go to New York with you today because my wife's sick." And my first thought was, she better be dying because she better be really sick. I'm just kidding. I'm good friends with Helen. I said, okay, if Helen's sick, you need to stay home. I went to the meeting, and a number of NFL staffers in the room. And after the first couple gentlemen went and gave us some productive feedback, the third gentleman said, "I think we need to turn the table here." Indianapolis taught us a lot. Indianapolis taught us how a community can come together with a common goal and execute it and put a heart in the Super Bowl, which we've never had before. And I thought that was the greatest compliment for this community. But it took hard work. It took hard work being civil to each other, working hard together, collaborating on many difficult topics. Some of the characters were hard to love and hard to be kind to, trust me. There was deep division, fractured relationships, and differences, but everyone committed themselves to civility as the priority, and to be kind, and to work well together, and to be productive. So I believe in this community, it is what sets us apart. We have a lot of work to do. I'm not minimizing that, but we know how to do it. We've done it before. And we can do it again as we go forward. And it is one of the reasons that this community is set apart from many others. The success and the camaraderie from the Super Bowl was built on individual conversations. As a leader, I felt I had to prepare myself and my team daily for the spirit of civility. And I had to bring it into every conversation. I did develop a couple practices during that period that I thought I would share a couple of those with you. In really challenging circumstances and conversations, when our flesh takes over our tongues and we want to be uncivil to each other, my go-to was always to put an extra chair in the room. Any meeting, difficult negotiations we would have, lots of people coming in from around the country, lots of challenging conversations on other people wanting to prioritize what was right for Indianapolis, us knowing what was right for our own community, prioritizing the Near East Side, prioritizing the community projects that we were working on over the other things. And when we knew we were going into difficult conversations, we always put an empty chair at the end of the table. And for me, that was my reminder that Christ was in the room and that he was sitting there. And I wanted to make sure in our conversations that we were honoring our faith in the way we were speaking, in the conversations that we were having, in our responses to people rather than our reactions to people, and what feedback he would give if he was with us. And for me, it was an effective tool. I still use it today, and there are those days that your flesh wants to take over your tongue. So as leaders, I challenge each of us tonight to develop our own practices, whatever works for you, to maintain that attitude of civility that Michael's been talking about. And whatever your specific reminder is, make it part of your regular routine. This all starts with each of us. And if we treated each other in the ways that Michael had described to us and lead with a servant's heart in humility, with patience for one another, really listening to each other, guarding against our own pride, our own self-righteousness, and without judgment, and we're willing to have those hard conversations and respect for one another, imagine how far this community can continue to go. We have accomplished so much together, but we still have hard work ahead. So back to hope. Michael inspired us tonight in a bold and a beautiful way. Reclaiming hope is an active, not a passive response to his call. Each of us have baggage we bring to the table and things that have hardened us in our lives, but that shouldn't hold us hostage. If we employ the attitude that Michael has shared with us tonight, I think about how that can impact all of us and the circles that we're all in. We want to seize every opportunity to work to depolarize all of the platoons that we each have influence on. So make it personal. What can you do right here in Indy to make sure we are going forward with this thinking? I loved when you said tonight, start with a self-critique and self-governance. So a gut check on our motivations for the things that we're all involved in now and the things that we want to continue to get involved in. Approach our partnerships. There's so many great partnerships in this community, great partnerships with private, with nonprofits, variety of organizations. Partnerships are another thing we have stood tall on, and we need to keep doing those in this true spirit of what partner means. We need to approach our conversations with the goal of reducing disagreements and invest in our own spirit of civility, knowing that all these relationships matter and we're all stronger together. He also mentioned that it takes courage. It sure does. It takes a lot of courage to maintain that attitude all the time, but it's important. So I challenge you to prepare your own hearts and be the examples and leaders that we all try to be each and every day. Every interaction matters, not just some of them, but all of them. And how we approach all these conversations together as we go forward is a choice. It's a choice made by you and you alone. Every day we make those choices on how we're going to interact with each other. Achieving and maintaining civility to one another. Another favorite thing he said tonight, public grace. I love that term, public grace. That's how we find the common ground and shared space that we're all searching for in our quest all together for a healthy community. So thank you for coming tonight. Appreciate you listening, and Dave's going to come up and challenge us.
Thank you, Allison. So we're going to enter a brief time of Q&A, and I'll get us kicked off. Please I think there's wireless mics that'll be going around, so just raise your hand if you've got a question, and we'll call it out. Please keep your questions civil, brief, brief, and no grandstanding, please. So I'll kick us off. Michael, Allison, we seem to live in an era where people say things online that they would never say sitting across the table from someone. And many people of faith seem to be the worst offenders at this at times. And I'm wondering very practically, how can we lead, and what's an effective antidote to, because at least for me, I know I can just tend to withdraw and observe rather than to sometimes engage and thoughtfully. So curious, any thoughts on how to, or just an antidote to participating in a helpful way at times?
Great. It's an excellent question. A few things. I find myself, the way that social media acts as a formative agent is really powerful. And so I find just in my own life, and as I advise others, that taking regular breaks from that form of engagement is just really, really powerful. So I recently took like a 40-day break from Twitter, and Twitter is my preferred social medium. I like the easy engagement, the fact that it's character limited, so I'm not a big Facebook sort of arguer, but Twitter is something that I like the rules of it. But I sort of realized, and I think many of us would realize, as you said, the other thing that Twitter does is, it's disembodied. And so I argued in my talk that civility is a way of recognizing the other person's dignity. Well, on social media, the humanness is not as readily apparent. So it's very easy to engage with people as if they are avatars and not real people. And so taking a break from social media is something that's been helpful to me. Recognizing just the futility of so many of the conversations we get involved in. I've never gotten in an argument on social media and felt like great about it after, and so there has to be some sort of learning process where we actually instill discipline in ourselves. There's no way that we could police other people's conversation. The best thing we could do is make sure we're not contributing to the problem. I will say I have some friends who there are some very practical things. So I don't quote tweet people to disagree with them. I think that that's a manipulative thing to do. If you're in a conversation with someone, don't keep it at the reply level, please. Don't quote tweet them out to blow up their feed and kind of all that stuff. So you can get really practical. But the other practical suggestion I found is try and meet with the people that you're disagreeing with. If you're in the same town as they are, or if there's some way, I'll DM someone and say, hey, I don't understand what you meant here, or it seems like you don't understand where I'm coming from. Instead of hashing this out in this very performative way, I'd love to take you out for a cup of coffee, and we could see if we could come to some kind of understanding, or at least understand where we're coming from. So.
Yeah.
I agree with everything Michael said. I'm just going to add one thing. For me, the discipline I use to answer your question is response versus reaction. And so if I respond to anything on social media, I question myself as a discipline. Was that a response or a reaction? Because if it's a reaction, it's usually not good, and I take it off. But if it's something that is a response, then I usually feel okay about it.
That's good. Thank you, guys. Who's got Peggy? You're close enough. I can repeat it. What's your question? Or she's got a mic for you. There you go.
Michael, as we were talking earlier, loved hearing you on the podcast, Road Back to You and Typology. The first thing that you did on Road Back to You was in August of 16. Yeah. And you were talking about some things that you mentioned here, but what I thought I heard you say, you used that same example of the parents, in the 60s. And
right.
then,
Yeah.
But what I thought I heard you say is that not just people who are engaged in politics, but people just generally are looking to politicians to meet their inner needs. Can you talk a little more about that?
I think it goes to the very core of what we're wrestling with now. That the C.S. Lewis quote is really, I think, apt. And I don't want to get too... Again, this is one of those things that you really want to put the idea out and allow people to self-assess. If people feel like you're sort of playing armchair psychology with them, you just want to be really sensitive, because I really think this goes to a sort of core insecurities that people have. I think what you can generally say about our politics right now is that people are going to politics to express all kinds of personal insecurities and resentments and longings that politics is not created to fill. People are going to politics to meet spiritual needs. Politics does a poor job of meeting those needs, but if it will get your vote, politicians will attempt to fill the spiritual void nonetheless. And that's a lot of what we have going on right now, and we could blame sort of the system, we could blame the politicians, we could blame the PAC. What we need to recognize is that they're responding to incentives that voters are giving them. That at some fundamental level, the state of our politics is a reflection of the state of our souls. And it's so easy to obfuscate and to blame the system, but if politicians weren't able to manipulate those parts of ourselves, then they want to do it. Politicians only do what they get rewarded for doing. And I don't say that cynically. I say, politicians, their job is to respond to incentives and disincentives that the people put out there in our system. And so that we need to be, so in my book, I talk about an other-centered politics, that if we actually enter into politics, either as people who do it vocationally or as voters, if we enter into politics with our neighbors in mind, not just for sort of self-aggrandizement and self-expression, then that loosens the force of some of the emotional manipulation that takes place.
That's good. Yes, sir. Right over here. Get you next.
If we think about most of the noise that's made politically and social media-wise, et cetera, is made by far left or far right. That's where the noise comes from. the center is where most of us live. Can you talk about the decline of centrist candidates?
Yeah, I can. So I write about, my book covers a lot of controversial terrain. There is no argument that gets more pushback, especially when I'm on college campuses, than the one I'm about to make right now. And that is 43% of Americans are political independents, and that is a profound problem for our politics. We have all of this rhetoric surrounding being a political independent. You know, these are people who are too morally pure for either of the political parties. They're saying a pox on both your houses. They're shaking up Washington. And can I just tell you, none of that is true. Political independents are actually unilaterally, and I say this with great love and affection, political independents are actually unilaterally withdrawing from one of the primary levers that we have for influencing our politics. And let me show you how this works in a very paradoxical way. They think that they're sending a message to the parties that neither party is good enough for them. What in fact is the effect of their withdrawing from political parties is that now you have political parties that are completely made up of people who don't disagree with one dot or tittle of the party platform. We used to have big, robust, diverse political parties with political diversity within the political parties. So the parties had to reconcile differing views within themselves. And that just isn't the case anymore. What our politics needs more than ever are committed Republicans, and this from my perspective, committed Republicans who are proud to say that they're Republicans, who nonetheless are willing to push the Republicans from inside the party on their views on immigration reform. What the Democratic Party needs now more than ever are committed Democrats who are happy to call themselves Democrats, who are willing to push the party internally when it comes to the issue of life. And right now we just don't have that. Senator Joe Donnelly, whose office voted against his party on a key life bill that just came up. But those people like Joe Donnelly are definitely endangered. And so what I encourage people is actually to, I'll say the last thing on this. When you sign up for a political party at the DMV, there's no fine print that says, I hereby sign over my conscience to the... You enter politics to influence politics, not for politics to influence you. And that's a key sort of paradigm we need to keep in mind. And we'll see more centrist politicians do that if we actually concentrate on building up institutions and political will for those politicians. There's so much more to say on that, but I'll leave it on that.
We'll keep moving. Sajjan, do you have a question?
My friend, so good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Hi, Michael. So I'm going to offer a counter narrative and have you respond, okay?
Never mind, you're not my friend anymore.
So rather than hope being the solution to our problem of lack of civility, the counter narrative is it's the problem. And what I mean is it's not that we have lost hope that we need to reclaim it, we've misplaced hope. That politics has taken a form of idolatry in this country, and so we look to our political leaders as saviors, saviors of the problems that we have in the world. And so whether it's an election cycle or a bill, we're doing the equivalent of a Hail Mary. We have to get this leader elected, we have to get this bill passed, because then we're going to solve immigration, or then we're going to solve education, or then we're going to solve health. And the reality is, these problems are so multifaceted, they've only always been solved by a very long, slow ground game that we seem to have gotten away from. And so I'd love to hear you respond to that maybe what's going through in the country in this lack of civility is helping push people away from politics as actually potentially being able to solve this, because people are losing hope that it can. And it's redirecting perhaps that hope in a better apparatus to say, maybe what actually we need is not the right leader or candidate or bill, but a much slower, longer ground game to bubble up what I would call a better positioning of hope and where it all really belongs.
So this was the topic of my talk at the Q conference, which you've spoken at a couple weeks ago. So I'll give something of an abridged. I completely agree with you, which is to say, I'll say this. Humans are hoping creatures. They're going to hope in something. We could have an extended conversation about whether there's a tie between rising religious disaffiliation and rising secularism and politics coming in to fill the gap. I tend to think that there's something to be said there. Here's what I tell people. When your hope is in the right place, you can hope for all kinds of things. And so there's my former boss entered a quote into the lexicon. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It was printed on the rug in the Oval Office. The president had it. Incoming presidents get a budget to redesign the Oval Office. And so President Trump hasn't redesigned his, but being in DC, I got to see a blueprint, and it's going to be amazing. Gold-plated walls with the words Trump emblazoned on them. It's going to be pretty beautiful. But we didn't spend that much money. But the one thing President Obama did was make this carpet with that quote around it. It's attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. on the carpet, but King was actually quoting a clergyman from a century earlier, this guy Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker said, Jefferson trembled when he thought of slavery and knew it was unjust. Soon all America will tremble. King used the phrase a century later, but it's amazing. That phrase is wedged in between. I wish I had the quote in front of me. Someone grabbed my book from the King. The entire quote is wedged between King reflecting on the fact that Caesar had made all of these promises. Caesar had declared that he was Lord, and yet it was Jesus who died on a cross, so that, King writes, even the date of Caesar's birth will be dated by the name of Jesus. And then he says, after this, he talks about, injustice may reign today, but soon the triumphant beats of the drums of Easter will come rolling in. And then at the end of this beautiful line, he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. For King, all of his political action was not because he hoped in politics, but because he was grounded in something deeper. And from that ground, he found all kinds of hopeful expressions and ways that he thought the world could be renewed in the intervening time. And we could get into a long theological conversation about that. But I think that would be the thing. When I talk to people, I say, the safest place to engage in politics is not with your feet planted in politics, but with your feet planted in the gospel. And when your hope is in the right place, then you could do all kinds of good things. But I'd actually agree with your assessment.
All right, we probably have time for one or two more. Does anyone else have a question? Right here.
You, Michael, mentioned about students, like high school students, kind of getting nightmares about, especially this past election. I'm a high school educator in the public school system, and there have been multiple situations where in my classroom it has gotten ice cold because one kid is on one political side, another kid is on another, especially with the walkout recently, a month ago. It got pretty toxic, like pretty quick, and my initial reaction is to withdraw and just say, okay, be nice to each other, let's learn something. But they're done, they're out of it at that point. So any practical solutions on how to lead this conversation of kindness and civility with 16-year-olds? Because it's really hard. So, and I'm an English teacher, so I have this space to do that, which I love, but it's not my thing, so.
we're both going to say something, but just a thought on that. Part of the problem is we're not, you're exactly right, we're not teaching our younger kids and our students how to have the tools to deal with healthy conflict, in my opinion. These are tools they have to learn, because in life, in business, in marriage, healthy conflict is an important part of all of it. And to help them understand the shared space of that it is okay to disagree and still be kind to one another. You almost can, separate, all these things, but you're right. How do you get them, especially emotionally charged 16 and 17-year-olds, to come into that space and be able to do it? And unfortunately, it's going to take more of your time, which I know as an educator, you hardly have any time to do that. But getting them to sit down together and facilitating conversation, because leaving it to 16 and 17-year-olds is not going to work. They don't have the skills and tools to do it. I think from my perspective, unfortunately, it's going to take more of your time or more of some other adult's time who does have those skills to teach them those differences. And with everything that's going on in the country right now, it's even harder because they've got some poor examples to follow. And everybody wants instant gratification. So if I'm mad about it today, I want to get it out today. Back to the gentleman that was talking about the slow ground effort. Part of our problem today is patience, lack of. Everyone is not everyone. I'm not judging everybody, but patience is not something that we are all teaching anymore, and that we are all making a priority for our kids because they have instant everything. So back to your question, I don't know that that's helpful, but I think facilitation from an adult's perspective and teaching them the tools and to respond to each other and not react to each other is my thought.
As an English teacher, you actually have access to really tremendous resources for this. A lot of time, stratency and incivility is due to a really shallow perception of the human condition. And so both from a social studies history background, where you could lay out both the history of politics is basically a history of unintended consequences. And young people need to understand that. That doesn't mean that you don't engage. That doesn't mean, but so many people of goodwill, which I'm assuming your students are of goodwill, have come to see that the policies that they fought tooth and nail for a decade ago actually didn't accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. So that would be the first thing. And then back to the English, the use of memoir, the use of story to help young people understand the humanity of the people that they disagree with is just really critical. Again, just to go back to, I think, the first question, we have a politics right now that is thrives off of dehumanizing opponents because it makes it much easier, frankly, for you to hate them if you don't view them as human beings. And so, the great resources of the classics and of literature is that it does not allow for that. It actually fights against that. And so, that would be the best advice. But we do have to recognize that. There are all kinds of, back to what you said, there are all kinds of critiques that we can make of how younger people are engaging in politics, but man, is it rich coming from the examples that I've set, the examples that their parents' generation has set. And so we need to be really careful that we're not squashing the civic urges of young people out of a sense of propriety that, frankly, those that they see in leadership haven't held up too well. Yeah.
All right, last question right here. So we got
I wonder if you have some thoughts about whether term limitations might have actually a beneficial effect in terms of when you say that politicians are behaving in their own self-interest for votes, but yet, for Sachin's argument on the other side, is there a benefit to having a consistency, and people that have been consistently and understand the way government works and have an understanding of a long view where term limitations could create a type of chaos where there's a continual escalation of these forces away from understanding sort of the long and patient way to progress?
I think it cuts in so many different ways. I could think of examples of long-serving people in political leadership that, because they have a long record and have had to make difficult decisions that sort of transcend momentary sort of political moments. I think specifically of, Senator Lugar's a great example. I think of especially those with foreign policy mandates, chairs of Foreign Relations Committee, like Dianne Feinstein, even to some, like she's had to, there's a responsibility bestowed on her that she has to take foreign policy with a level of seriousness that her position and Senator Lugar's position was going to sway members of their party in a way that senators that were only in for a term, just their words didn't carry that weight. So it sometimes cuts that way, but then it also cuts sometimes that the power becomes so calcified, so entrenched, so moneyed that you're actually protecting some of the worst actors in our politics. So I don't think term limits are necessarily like a silver bullet solution. I could see unintended, I could see bad consequences coming from them, and they might have some good effects in this area of civility.
All right, let's give them another round of applause. Thank you, Michael. Then I'm going to turn it over to Cherie to close us out.
Thanks, Dave. So we'll leave you with just a few recommendations. And one of our recommendations is that you avail yourself of the opportunity to purchase Reclaiming Hope. It will be available for sale right outside this room. Michael will be signing. It's a fantastic book. We highly recommend it. A second recommendation is to avail yourself of the invitation that should be seated on each of your chairs, which is to join the Trinity Forum Society. Your membership in the society helps make possible programs such as this, both in Indianapolis and in other places. In addition, if you are interested in contributing and being a sponsor to the Indiana initiative, please feel free to speak to me, to talk with Doug Wilson, or my colleague Colleen O'Malley. And Colleen, if you could just stand up. There are many benefits associated with being a member of the Trinity Forum Society. Earlier, Michael was talking a little bit about the virtues and advantages of reading great literature. One of the things we do is publish quarterly readings, which takes the best of literature and letters, boils it down, provides an introduction, giving context and background, discussion questions in the back, so it's essentially a book club in a bag, and something that we have made available to help inform, inspire, and equip leaders across the country. In addition, there are other benefits, such as our daily What We Are Reading curated feed, monthly podcast interviews with thought leaders, as well as invitations to events like this. And as a special one-time offer, those of you who join tonight will get a free copy of Reclaiming Hope. So we hope that you will take advantage of that. Your membership in this, as I said, helps make available programs such as this, and really significantly furthers our mission to try to provide that space to essentially push back a culture that focuses on distraction, trivialization, polarization, division, and incivility, to offer a space that is rigorous, that focuses on the deepest questions, and does so in a spirit of warm hospitality. If you're interested in discussing further some of the questions that were discussed tonight, one of the things I want to just alert you to is the fact that there will be a reading group being hosted in less than a month on May 15th at 7 p.m. to discuss the Trinity Forum reading Politics, Morality, and Civility, which takes excerpts from Václav Havel's Summer Meditations, where he faced deep divisions in his own riven Czech Republic and actually took time to reflect on how to lead in the midst of the divisions that he was facing. Often it can be very helpful. It's been said that the actual proves the possible, to look at the real-life struggles of someone who faced those kind of challenges and what they did to help inspire our own thinking, for what might be possible. This Trinity Forum reading group will be led by Nicole Miller. And Nicole, I know you're here someplace. If you could just wave your hand. She will be facilitating that, and it will be held at, can you remind us where it'll be held? Yes, May 15th. So invitations will be going out, but there will also be a sign-up sheet just outside the door tonight, so you can sign up for that evening conversation. We'll hope you'll join us for future evening conversations here in Indy. There'll be information on the fall event that will be going out in the next couple of months, so stay tuned for that. And as we wrap up, finally, it's appropriate to end with thanks, and certainly there are many people to thank tonight who made this possible. I'd just like to thank again Doug Wilson, our trustee, really the linchpin in all of this, along with Greg Enos and Joanna Taft for their vision, sponsorship, and hospitality. Thank again our partners, Heron High and Janet McNeil, along with Joanna Taft, and Edge with Dave Neff and Liz Henderson. I also was remiss in not acknowledging Jason Simmons from Heron, who I know has done a lot of work behind the scenes to make this happen, as well as our volunteers, several from Heron, including Robin Knopp, Mary Chalmers, Catherine Kidd, Lori Toombs, and former Trinity Forum Academy alumni Cindy Somm. We so appreciate your help. Special thanks also to Jennifer Driscoll, photographer extraordinaire, and Evans AV for video assistance. I'd also like to thank my fantastic colleagues, Alyssa Abraham and Colleen O'Malley, who do so much behind the scenes to make this possible. And finally, thank you again to our speakers, Michael and Allison, and to each of you for coming this evening. Good night.